Chapter 28 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 28. An Understanding Between Lovers. It was well they had so early and so truly strengthened the spirit to bear, for the events which had to be endured soon came thick and threefold. Every evening Mr. and Miss Benson thought the worst must be over, and every day brought some fresh occurrence to touch upon the raw place. They could not be certain, until they had seen all their acquaintances, what difference it would make in the cordiality of their reception. In some cases it made much, and Miss Benson was proportionably indignant. She felt this change in behaviour more than her brother. His great pain arose from the coolness of the Bradshaws, with all the faults which had at times grated on his sensitive nature, but which he now forgot, and remembered only their kindness. They were his old familiar friends, his kind if ostentatious patrons, his great personal interest, out of his own family, and he could not get over the suffering he experienced from seeing their large square pew empty on Sundays, from perceiving how Mr. Bradshaw, though he bowed in a distant manner when he and Mr. Benson met face to face, shunned him as often as he possibly could. All that happened in the household, which once was as patent to him as his own, was now a sealed book. He heard of its doings by chance, if he heard at all. Just at the time when he was feeling the most depressed from this cause, he met Jemima at a sudden turn of the street. He was uncertain for a moment how to accost her, but she saved him all doubt. In an instant she had his hand in both of hers, her face flushed with honest delight. "Oh, Mr. Benson, I am so glad to see you. I have so wanted to know all about you. How is poor Ruth, dear Ruth? I wonder if she has forgiven me my cruelty to her. And I may not go to her now, when I should be so glad and thankful to make up for it." "I never heard you had been cruel to her. I am sure she does not think so." "She ought, she must. What is she doing?" "Oh, I have so much to ask. I can never hear enough, and papa says—" She hesitated a moment, afraid of giving pain, and then, believing that they would understand the state of affairs and the reason for her behaviour better if she told the truth, she went on. "Papa says I must not go to your house. I suppose it's right to obey him." "Certainly, my dear, it is your clear duty. We know how you feel towards us." "Oh, but if I could do any good, if I could be of any use or comfort to any of you, especially to Ruth, I should come, duty or not. I believe it would be my duty," said she, hurrying on to try and stop any decided prohibition from Mr. Benson. "No, don't be afraid. I won't come till I know I can do some good. I hear bits about you through Sally every now and then, or I could not have waited so long, Mr. Benson," continued she, reddening very much. "I think you did quite right about poor Ruth." "Not in the falsehood, my dear." "No, perhaps not in that. I was not thinking of that. But I have been thinking a great deal about poor Ruth's. You know I could not help it when everybody was talking about it, and it made me think of myself, and what I am. With a father, and mother, and home, and careful friends, I am not likely to be tempted like Ruth. But, oh, Mr. Benson," said she, lifting her eyes, which were full of tears, to his face, for the first time since she began to speak, "if you knew all I have been thinking and feeling this last year, you would see how I have yielded to every temptation that was able to come to me, and seeing how I have no goodness or strength in me, and how I might just have been like Ruth, or rather worse than she ever was, because I am more headstrong and passionate by nature. I do so thank you and love you for what you did for her. And will you tell me really and truly now if I can ever do anything for Ruth? If you'll promise me that, I won't rebel unnecessarily against papa. But if you don't, I will, and come to see you all this very afternoon. Remember, I trust you," said she, breaking away. Then turning back, she came to ask after Leonard. "He must know something of it," said she. "Does he feel it much?" "Very much," said Mr Benson. Jemima shook her head sadly. "It is hard upon him," said she. "It is," Mr Benson replied. For in truth, Leonard was their greatest anxiety indoors. His health seemed shaken. He spoke half sentences in his sleep, which showed that in his dreams he was battling on his mother's behalf against an unkind and angry world. And then he would wail to himself, and utter sad words of shame, which they never thought had reached his ears. By day he was in general grave and quiet, but his appetite varied, and he was evidently afraid of going into the streets, dreading to be pointed at as an object of remark. Each separately in their hearts longed to give him change of scene, but they were all silent, for where was the requisite money to come from? His temper became fitful and variable. At times he would be most sullen against his mother, and then give way to a passionate remorse. When Mr Benson caught Ruth's look of agony at her child's rebuffs, his patience failed, or rather, I should say, he believed that a stronger, severer hand than hers was required for the management of the lad. But when she heard Mr Benson say so, she pleaded with him. "Have patience with Leonard," she said. "I have deserved the anger that is fretting in his heart. It is only I who can reinstate myself in his love and respect. I have no fear. When he sees me really striving hard and long to do what is right, he must love me. I am not afraid." Even while she spoke, her lips quivered, and her colour went and came with eager anxiety. So Mr Benson held his peace, and let her take her course. It was beautiful to see the intuition by which she divined what was passing in every fold of her child's heart, so as to be always ready with the right words to soothe or strengthen him. Her watchfulness was unwearied, and with no thought of self-tainting in it, or else she might have often paused to turn aside and weep at the clouds of shame which came over Leonard's love for her, and hid it from all but her faithful heart. She believed and knew that he was yet her own affectionate boy, although he might be gloomily silent or apparently hard and cold. And in all this Mr Benson could not choose but admire the way in which she was insensibly teaching Leonard to conform to the law of right, to recognise duty in the mode in which every action was performed. When Mr Benson saw this, he knew that all goodness would follow, and that the claims which his mother's infinite love had on the boy's heart would be acknowledged at last, and all the more fully because she herself never urged them, but silently admitted the force of the reason that caused them to be for a time forgotten. By and by Leonard's remorse at his ungracious and sullen ways to his mother, ways that alternated with passionate fitful bursts of clinging love, assumed more the character of repentance. He tried to do so no more. But still his health was delicate. He was averse to going out of doors. He was much graver and sadder than became his age. It was what must be an inevitable consequence of what had been, and Ruth had to be patient and pray in secret, and with many tears, for the strength she needed. She knew what it was to dread the going out into the streets after her story had become known. For days and days she had silently shrunk from this effort. But one evening towards dusk, Miss Benson was busy, and asked her to go on an errand for her, and Ruth got up and silently obeyed her. That silence as to inward suffering was only one part of her peculiar and exquisite sweetness of nature, part of the patience with which she accepted her penance. Her true instincts told her that it was not right to disturb others with many expressions of her remorse, that the holiest repentance consisted in a quiet and daily sacrifice. Still, there were times when she wearied pitifully of her inaction. She was so willing to serve and work, and every one despised her services. Her mind, as I have said before, had been well cultivated during these last few years, so now she used all the knowledge she had gained in teaching Leonard, which was an employment that Mr Benson relinquished willingly, because he felt that it would give her some of the occupation that she needed. She endeavoured to make herself useful in the house in every way she could, but the waters of housekeeping had closed over her place during the time of her absence at Mr Bradshaw's, and besides, now that they were trying to restrict every unnecessary expense, it was sometimes difficult to find work for 3 women. Many and many a time Ruth turned over in her mind every possible chance of obtaining employment for her leisure hours, and nowhere could she find it. Now and then Sally, who was her confidant in this wish, procured her some needlework, but it was of a coarse and common kind, soon done, lightly paid for. But whatever it was, Ruth took it, and was thankful, although it added but a few pence to the household purse. I do not mean that there was any great need of money, but a new adjustment of expenditure was required, a reduction of wants which had never been very extravagant. Ruth's salary of £40 was gone, while more of her keep, as Sally called it, was thrown upon the Bensons. Mr Benson received about £80 a year for his salary as minister. Of this he knew that £20 came from Mr Bradshaw, and when the old man appointed to collect the pew rents brought him the quarterly amount, and he found no diminution in them, he inquired how it was, and learnt that, although Mr Bradshaw had expressed to the collector his determination never to come to chapel again, he had added that of course his pew rent should be paid all the same. But this Mr Benson could not suffer, and the old man was commissioned to return the money to Mr Bradshaw, as being what his deserted minister could not receive. Mr and Miss Benson had about £30 or £40 coming in annually from a sum which, in happier days, Mr Bradshaw had invested in canal shares for them. Although their income did not fall much short of 100 a year, and they lived in the chapel house free of rent. So Ruth's small earnings were but very little in actual hard commercial account, though in another sense they were much, and Miss Benson always received them with quiet simplicity. By degrees, Mr Benson absorbed some of Ruth's time in a gracious and natural way. He employed her mind in all the kind offices he was accustomed to render to the poor around him, and as much of the peace and ornament of life as they gained now was gained on a firm basis of truth. If Ruth began low down to find her place in the world, at any rate there was no flaw in the foundation. Leonard was still their great anxiety. At times the question seemed to be, could he live through all this trial of the elasticity of childhood? And then they knew how precious a blessing, how true a pillar of fire he was to his mother, and how black the night, and how dreary the wilderness would be when he was not. The child and the mother were each messengers of God, angels to each other. They had long gaps between the pieces of intelligence respecting the Bradshaws. Mr Bradshaw had at length purchased the house at Abermouth, and they were much there. The way in which the Bensons heard most frequently of the family of their former friends was through Mr Farquhar. He called on Mr. Benson about a month after the latter had met Jemima in the street. Mr. Farquhar was not in the habit of paying calls on any one, and though he had always entertained and evinced the most kind and friendly feeling towards Mr. Benson, he had rarely been in the Chapel house. Mr. Benson received him courteously, but he rather expected that there would be some especial reason alleged, before the conclusion of the visit, for its occurrence, more particularly as Mr. Farquhar sat talking on the topics of the day in a somewhat absent manner, as if they were not the subjects most present to his mind. The truth was, he could not help recurring to the last time when he was in that room, waiting to take Leonard a ride, and his heart beating rather more quickly than usual at the idea that Ruth might bring the boy in when he was equipped. He was very full now of the remembrance of Ruth, and yet he was also most thankful, most self-congratulatory, that he had gone no further in his admiration of her, that he had never expressed his regard in words, that no one, as he believed, was cognizant of the incipient love which had grown partly out of his admiration and partly out of his reason. He was thankful to be spared any implication in the 9 days' wonder which her story had made in Eccleston. And yet his feeling for her had been of so strong a character that he winced as with extreme pain at every application of censure to her name. These censures were often exaggerated, it is true, but when they were just in their judgment of the outward circumstances of the case, they were not the less painful and distressing to him. His first rebound to Jemima was occasioned by Mrs. Bradshaw's account of how severely her husband was displeased at her daughter's having taken part with Ruth, and he could have thanked and almost blessed Jemima when she dropped in. She dared do no more. Her pleading excuses and charitable explanations on Ruth's behalf. Jemima had learnt some humility from the discovery which had been to her so great a shock. Standing, she had learnt to take heed lest she fell, and when she had once been aroused to a perception of the violence of the hatred which she had indulged against Ruth, she was more reticent and measured in the expression of all her opinions. It showed how much her character had been purified from pride, that now she felt aware that what in her was again attracting Mr. Farquhar was her faithful advocacy of her rival, wherever such advocacy was wise or practicable. He was quite unaware that Jemima had been conscious of his great admiration for Ruth. He did not know that she had ever cared enough for him to be jealous, but the unacknowledged bond between them now was their grief, and sympathy, and pity for Ruth. Only in Jemima these feelings were ardent, and would fain have become active, while in Mr. Farquhar they were strongly mingled with thankfulness that he had escaped a disagreeable position and a painful notoriety. His natural caution induced him to make a resolution never to think of any woman as a wife until he had ascertained all her antecedents, from her birth upwards, and the same spirit of caution, directed inwardly, made him afraid of giving too much pity to Ruth, for fear of the conclusions to which such a feeling might lead him. But still his old regard for her, for Leonard, and his esteem and respect for the Bensons, induced him to lend a willing ear to Jemima's earnest entreaty that he would go and call on Mr. Benson, in order that she might learn something about the family in general, and Ruth in particular. It was thus that he came to sit by Mr. Benson's study fire, and to talk in an absent way to that gentleman. How they got on the subject he did not know, more than one half of his attention being distracted, but they were speaking about politics when Mr. Farquhar learned that Mr. Benson took in no newspaper. "Will you allow me to send you over my Times? I have generally done with it before 12 o'clock, and after that it is really waste paper in my house. You will oblige me by making use of it." "I am sure I am very much obliged to you for thinking of it, but do not trouble yourself to send it. Leonard can fetch it." "How is Leonard now?" asked Mr. Farquhar, and he tried to speak indifferently, but a grave look of intelligence clouded his eyes as he looked for Mr. Benson's answer. "I have not met him lately." "No," said Mr. Benson, with an expression of pain in his countenance, though he, too, strove to speak in his usual tone. "Leonard is not strong, and we find it difficult to induce him to go much out of doors." There was a little silence for a minute or two, during which Mr. Farquhar had to check an unbidden sigh. But, suddenly rousing himself into a determination to change the subject, he said, "You will find a rather lengthened account of the exposure of Sir Thomas Campbell's conduct at Baden. He seems to be a complete blackleg, in spite of his baronetcy. I fancy the papers are glad to get hold of anything just now." "Who is Sir Thomas Campbell?" asked Mr. Benson. "Oh, I thought you might have heard the report, a true one, I believe, of Mr. Donne's engagement to his daughter. He must be glad she jilted him now, I fancy, after this public exposure of her father's conduct." That was an awkward speech, as Mr. Farquhar felt, and he hastened to cover it by going on without much connection. "Dick Bradshaw is my informant about all these projected marriages in high life. They are not much in my way, but, since he has come down from London to take his share in the business, I think I have heard more of the news and the scandal of what, I suppose, would be considered high life, than ever I did before, and Mr. Donne's proceedings seem to be an especial object of interest to him." "And Mr. Donne is engaged to a Miss Campbell, is he?" "Was engaged, if I understood right. She broke off the engagement to marry some Russian prince or other. A better match, Dick Bradshaw told me, I assure you," continued Mr. Farquhar, smiling. "I am a very passive recipient of all such intelligence, and might very probably have forgotten all about it, if the Times of this morning had not been so full of the disgrace of the young lady's father." "Richard Bradshaw has quite left London, has he?" asked Mr. Benson, who felt far more interest in his old patron's family than in all the Campbells that ever were or ever would be. "Yes, he has come to settle down here. I hope he may do well, and not disappoint his father, who has formed very high expectations from him. I am not sure if they are not too high for any young man to realise." Mr. Farquhar could have said more, but Dick Bradshaw was Jemima's brother, and an object of anxiety to her. "I am sure I trust such a mortification, such a grief as any disappointment in Richard may not befall his father," replied Mr. Benson. "Jemima, Miss Bradshaw," said Mr. Farquhar, hesitating, "was most anxious to hear of you all. I hope I may tell her you are all well," with an emphasis on all. "That thank you, thank you. Thank her for us. We are all well, all except Leonard, who is not strong, as I said before. But we must be patient. Time, and such devoted tender love as he has from his mother, must do much." Mr. Farquhar was silent. "Send him to my house for the papers. It will be a little necessity for him to have some regular exercise, and to face the world. He must do it sooner or later." The two gentlemen shook hands with each other warmly on parting, but no further allusion was made to either Ruth or Leonard. So Leonard went for the papers. Stealing along by back streets, running with his head bent down, his little heart panting with dread of being pointed out as his mother's child, so he used to come back and run trembling to Sally, who would hush him up to her breast, with many a rough-spoken word of pity and sympathy. Mr Farquhar tried to catch him, to speak to him, and tame him, as it were, and by he contrived to interest him sufficiently to induce the boy to stay a little while in the house or stables or garden. But the race through the streets was always to be dreaded as the end of ever so pleasant a visit. Mr Farquhar kept up the intercourse with the Bensons which he had thus begun. He persevered in paying calls, quiet visits where not much was said, political or local news talked about, and the same inquiries always made and answered as to the welfare of the two families, who were estranged from each other. Mr Farquhar's reports were so little varied that Jemima grew anxious to know more particulars. "Oh, Mr Farquhar," said she, "do you think they tell you the truth? I wonder what Ruth can be doing to support herself and Leonard. Nothing that you can hear of, you say, and of course one must not ask the downright question. And yet I am sure they must be pinched in some way. Do you think Leonard is stronger?" "I am not sure. He is growing fast, and such a blow as he has had will be most certain to make him more thoughtful and full of care than most boys of his age. Both these circumstances may make him thin and pale, which he certainly is. Oh, how I wish I might go and see them all! I could tell in a twinkling the real state of things." She spoke with a tinge of her old impatience. "I will go again, and pay particular attention to anything you wish me to observe. You see, of course, I feel a delicacy about asking any direct questions, or even alluding in any way to these late occurrences." "And you never see Ruth by any chance?" "Never." They did not look at each other while this last question was asked and answered. "I will take the paper to-morrow myself. It will be an excuse for calling again, and I will try to be very penetrating, but I have not much hope of success." "Oh, thank you. It is giving you a great deal of trouble, but you are very kind." "Kind, Jemima!" he repeated, in a tone which made her go very red and hot. "Must I tell you how you can reward me? Will you call me Walter? Say, 'Thank you, Walter,' just for once." Jemima felt herself yielding to the voice and tone in which this was spoken, but her very consciousness of the depth of her love made her afraid of giving way, and anxious to be wooed, that she might be reinstated in her self-esteem. "No," said she, "I don't think I can call you so. You are too old. It would not be respectful." She meant it half in joke, and had no idea he would take the allusion to his age so seriously as he did. He rose up, and coldly, as a matter of form, in a changed voice, wished her good-bye. Her heart sank, yet the old pride was there. But as he was at the very door, some sudden impulse made her speak. "I have not vexed you, have I, Walter?" He turned round, glowing with a thrill of delight. She was as red as any rose. Her looks dropped down to the ground. They were not raised when, half an hour afterwards, she said, "You won't forbid my going to see Ruth, will you? Because if you do, I give you notice I shall disobey you." The arm around her waist clasped her yet more fondly at the idea, suggested by this speech, of the control which he should have a right to exercise over her actions at some future day. "Tell me," said he, "how much of your goodness to me this last happy hour has been owing to the desire of having more freedom as a wife than as a daughter?" She was almost glad that he should think she needed any additional motive to her love for him before she could have accepted him. She was afraid that she had betrayed the deep passionate regard with which she had long looked upon him. She was lost in delight at her own happiness. She was silent for a time. At length she said, "I don't think you know how faithful I have been to you ever since the days when you first brought me pistachio candy from London, when I was quite a little girl. Not more faithful than I have been to you," for in truth the recollection of his love for Ruth had utterly faded away, and he thought himself a model of constancy. "And you have tried me pretty well. What a vixen you have been!" Jemima sighed, smitten with the consciousness of how little she had deserved her present happiness, humble with the recollection of the evil thoughts that had raged in her heart during the time, which she remembered well, though he may have forgotten it, when Ruth had had the affection which her jealous rival coveted. "I may speak to your father, may I not, Jemima?" No. For some reason or fancy which she could not define, and could not be persuaded out of, she wished to keep their mutual understanding a secret. She had a natural desire to avoid the congratulations she expected from her family. She dreaded her father's consideration of the whole affair as a satisfactory disposal of his daughter to a worthy man, who, being his partner, would not require any abstraction of capital from the concern, and Richard's more noisy delight at his sister's having hooked so good a match. It was only her simple-hearted mother that she longed to tell. She knew that her mother's congratulations would not jar upon her, though they might not sound the full organ peal of her love. But all that her mother knew passed onwards to her father, so for the present, at any rate, she determined to realise her secret position alone. Somehow, the sympathy of all others that she most longed for was Ruth's, but the first communication of such an event was due to her parents. She imposed very strict regulations on Mr Farquhar's behaviour, and quarrelled and differed from him more than ever, but with a secret joyful understanding with him in her heart, even while they disagreed with each other, for similarity of opinion is not always, I think not often, needed for fullness and perfection of love. After Ruth's detection, as Mr Bradshaw used to call it, he said he could never trust another governess again, so Mary and Elizabeth had been sent to school the following Christmas, and their place in the family was but poorly supplied by the return of Mr Richard Bradshaw, who had left London, and been received as a partner. End of chapter 28.